Every night a different person walks down the street and screams for help. We aren't allowed to help them. Looking back, I feel dumb, completely stupid. Actually, I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right. Even for a studio, I should have known there had to be a catch. The day I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Someone knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up on my elbows. Two girls were peeking around my door frame. Foolishly, I had left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule: only leave your door open if you want to make new friends, and I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, fingering a box of Marlboro Reds. "Hey," she said, nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. "Did you just move in?" I laid back down, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. "Yeah, about 5 seconds ago." "Cool." The girls walked in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. "Grandma," I explained, feeling strangely defensive. "Cute," she replied, holding it up to her face. "Has anyone told you yet?" the other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into the back pocket of her jeans and was now tugging at her long red braids. "Jesus, Gianna, give her a second." "Well, she needs to know." "Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name." I blinked at the two strangers incredulously. I hadn't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they were touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. "My name's Arden," I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. "Did they tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Oh, of course they didn't. The rules." I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after at best skimming over. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. "Where did you move here from?" I ignored her. "What rules?" Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. "Something happens here every night." She began pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. "Something weird." "Like what?" I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. "Someone walks down the street," Gianna said, her voice reminding me of a camp counselor telling a scary story around the bonfire. "That one right down there." She pointed at my window. "It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour, but we aren't supposed to help them." I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. "It happens at a different time every night," the other one said softly. "We never know when it's coming." "Why?" She shrugged almost suddenly. "We don't know why." I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. "I don't believe you." The girl shrugged. "You don't have to. You'll see for yourself." The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying being true. It was too strange, too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank. They had to be hazing me or something. "Well, come back later," Gianna said matter-of-factly. "We'll show you." Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist, and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed my door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will. When he walked in, the other boy was smaller, but chubbier and nervous-looking, with a buzzcut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name, I was told, was Matteo. The girl named Gianna came in carrying a bottle of wine and that same slightly crumpled box of cigarettes. The other one, the girl I still didn't know the name of, was the only one who looked even somewhat apologetic. They all sat down on my dusty floor next to the window and motioned for me to join them. I sat between Will and the nameless girl, unsure whether I should continue feeling violated or if I should just give in to my strange, pushy neighbors. "Do you all live in this building?" I asked hesitantly, accepting the wine when it was passed to me. Yeah, Will answered with a grin. It seemed half-hearted. This building is where all the young people live. It's where they put us. Gianna cut in, lighting a cigarette. It didn't even occur to me to tell her not to smoke. Inside, we've all been sorted out. Forgive her, she's a bit of a conspiracy theorist. It's not a theory, she snapped, glaring at him. Look at the other ones next door, the middle-aged people with kids. But no grandkids across the street, old people, not a single 20-something in that entire building. May, tell him. So her name was May. I looked her over, admiring her smoky eye makeup and how she'd tied her hair up, long strands poking out like exploding fireworks. Stop it, May muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. You'll scare her. I'm not scared. She just shrugged at me, as if she didn't believe me. We passed the bottle around and then around again. I listened to them bicker and laugh. It was clear they'd all been friends for a while, and I felt a little bit like I was intruding even though they were in my apartment. Will asked me if I had gone to college, and I told him I did. But I dropped out. They all nodded sympathetically, which made me feel stupid. By midnight, I was a little bit buzzed, and my guard was beginning to fall. I had to admit it felt good to have friends. I had already mentally resigned myself to a life of solitude, at least for a while, but it seemed that might not actually have to be my fate. I laughed at Matteo and Gianna's drunken argument, passing a cigarette back and forth with May blowing the smoke out of my open window. I had almost completely forgotten why they were all over when it happened. All at once, a blaring alarm came from each of our phones like an Amber Alert. I could hear the sound echo throughout the neighborhood like an entire chorus of hundreds of phones going off, not just ours. I nearly leapt out of my skin. Not even Gianna laughed. All of them went quiet, and they looked at me as I took it out, frowning at the screen. Do not interfere. It's coming, Will whispered. He had changed, his eyes almost glassy and his voice soft and shaky. Matteo squeezed his shoulder. I looked at May. Her eyebrows were cinched together in concern, and she was stubbing out our cigarette against the windowsill, shrinking away. There it was again, that chill. It crept up my back, spreading along my scalp and making me shiver. Something felt deeply, deeply wrong. The others were quiet now, staring silently at the window. I was sitting up against the air, felt somehow warmer, like it was buzzing with something, or maybe I was just sweating. We sat there unmoving for what felt like half an hour. Right as I was getting tempted to ask what was going on, I heard it. It was far away and faint, but I still heard it. A cry. It continued as it got gradually closer, louder, more desperate. Help, please, my God, someone help me. Slowly I leaned out the window. I had to see it with my eyes, had to confirm there was actually someone out there, like they had said there would be. My new apartment was on the 4th floor, so it was hard to see who was down on the street without squinting. In the flickering streetlights, I could make out the outline of an elderly man. He was hunched over, wandering aimlessly from door to door, wearing only what looked like a hospital gown to cover his pale, broken body. Behind him trailed a path of dripping blood, although I couldn't see where it was coming from. Please, I'm hurt. I looked back at the others, my mouth hanging open. What is this? I demanded loudly. What the hell is this? May touched my arm, trying to calm me down. I pulled away from her. Arden, please, we have to help him. Why can't we help him? He's just an old man. We can't help him, trust me. I ignored her, leaning further out the window, prepared to call out to him. Before I could open my mouth, I froze. The man down there was still now facing our building. His head was tilted upwards, and I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking right at me. I immediately felt cold, like I was plummeting into ice water. Help me, he whimpered into the silent night air, his voice barely audible. Then he began to scream. That scream wasn't human, or at least not any human I had ever met. It was desperate, agonized. It made my stomach turn and my eyes prick with tears. I couldn't look away. The blood was coming from his arms. Or I should say his lack of arms. Where his arms should have been, there were only bloody, mangled stumps. They looked fresh. He didn't move other than a shaky sway, and his eyes didn't leave me. His shrieks slowly molded into words that I could just barely understand. Please, 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 May yanked me backwards away from the window. I landed on my ass and yelped in pain and horror. What is that thing? I whispered. I didn't mean to whisper, but that was all that came out. We don't know, May replied, her eyes trained on Will, who was crying now. Matteo held on to him like he might topple over. We just know to follow the rules. What happens if you don't follow the rules? I asked, and immediately regretted it. Will sobbed softly. Outside, the old man wailed. Gianna reached over and pulled the window shut, but it somehow did nothing to muffle the blood-curdling sound. Do you want to tell her, or should I? Matteo asked. Will just shook his head. He was clutching his locket now, turning the little heart over between his fingers. Matteo sighed and turned towards me. A couple of months ago, one of them Got two Will's girl Shannon. Gianna butted in. Her name was Shannon. Her name is Shannon. I swallowed. But whatever I did, nothing would force down the lump in my throat. What happened? Mateo shook his head. We don't know. We were all together. When the screaming started, usually we just ignore it. Now you know. No use in dwelling on it, but that night we think she saw something different. She started insisting she had to help, and she ran outside. We couldn't stop her. He paused, glancing over at Will. He was silent, and still the screaming outside had begun to pass, getting softer as it continued further down the street. Then what? He shrugged. Nothing. She was just gone. I pressed my lips together, trying to process all of this. I really had believed they were messing with me, but I had seen it. I had witnessed it firsthand, and it terrified me. Why doesn't anyone leave? He shrugged for a second time. Can't afford it, or people just don't care. Some people have left, but we all signed an NDA with the lease, so nobody ever knows. I frowned, thinking back to signing the paperwork, trying to remember. I could vaguely picture he was talking about. I had just assumed it was more legal jargon that I would never understand. Had I seriously signed a non-disclosure agreement without even noticing? A non-disclosure agreement without even noticing. After that, I told them I wanted to go to bed. I needed time to process all of this. They understood, and each one of them said goodbye before leaving me alone as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. For some strange reason, I thought of May's face when we had realized it was happening, how she had put out the cigarette and backed away from the window. Eventually, I was able to drift off to sleep. The next few weeks were difficult. I spent more and more time with my new neighbors. I came to find that they were right. I didn't think there was a single person older than 30 in our entire building, but I saw them all the time. Leaving the one next door, settling in was difficult. The others seemed so used to it. They cared. Of course it scared them, especially Will, but you could tell they had been here a while by the way they sighed, closing the blinds and focusing harder on whatever they were doing. Eventually I began to mimic them. It helped a little bit to pretend it was normal, as strange as that sounds. Moving out wasn't really an option for me anyways. I was a college dropout and I hadn't found a job yet. I was still just getting by on what I had managed to save up. Every night it was someone different. Some were more human, some seemed less, some were drenched in blood, their clothes ripped and strange, but some looked fairly normal. The worst were the children. They would run like injured chickens, screeching and banging on doors, begging for help. Sometimes they would try different things, say different things like they're coming, like I don't want to die, or even I'm sorry. There were a lot of children. One night while I was half awake, an alarm went off. It wasn't like the one on our phones. It was blaring, only somewhat muffled. By my window, my apartment glowed a flashing red from outside. I didn't even look. I was too scared of what I might see. I just covered my head with my pillow and tried to fall back asleep. I came to learn all of the theories, especially from Gianna. She thought we had all been chosen and predetermined to live here, all for some sick little government game. She thought maybe there were people betting on the different buildings, putting down money on who would interfere the least. See that? She said to me one day in the hallway, returning from a coffee run. Cameras everywhere. I didn't know if I believed her. I spent time with May mostly. We smoked on the front steps and people watched. It was strange to see what at night was such a sinister and gruesome neighborhood. During the day, bright and lively. She didn't talk much about the rules, so I didn't either. We didn't talk all that much in general. I found just enjoying each other's company. Right when I was beginning to feel comfortable was when it happened. It started with a birthday cake. Happy birthday. As May walked through the door, Mateo blew into his plastic party horn. The paper inflated, smacking Will on the side of the head. May's hand flew to her heart. Jesus Christ, you fuckers know I hate surprises. Gianna laughed and walked over to her. In her hands she held a chocolate cake haphazardly adorned with sprinkles and bright pink icing that read Happy Birthday May in the center. 20. For she set down the cake on the dresser and threw her arm around May's neck. How does it feel? Fucking awful. That's the spirit. Enough of this, Mateo cut in, weaving between them. Let's eat some cake, then let's go. Their tradition, I had learned, was to bar hop for birthdays. They told me there was no curfew here despite the rules, just a recommended time to be home, which was 10:30 p.m. Usually they said they got home before the alarm or spent the night somewhere else. We all took some cake. The boys took shots in the kitchen to pregame while I watched Gianna fuss over May's hair. I was never much of a partier. While at clubs or bars in college, I spent most of the time out back chatting with the smokers. But then again, I was never much of a friend group person either, so maybe the circumstances were changing. I watched them all troop outside to Mateo's car. I stuffed myself in the back, incredibly conscious of how close I was pressed into May, my other shoulder Rammed into the car door. Mateo's music cranked up to maximum volume hurt my ears, and the tiny space was packed with the smell of tobacco and various perfumes as we sped down the freeway toward the city. But it was nice, it was really nice. I found myself laughing with them and I hooked my arm around May's. When she weaseled her hand beneath my elbow, it was actually nice. As predicted, the bars they chose weren't exactly my scene. But this time, as opposed to college, I could stand it. I took shots, I followed them out. For smoke breaks, I even danced under the low purple lights. Until my feet ached inside, my chunky heels surely riddled with blisters. By the time we got to our third bar, I couldn't even feel it anymore, and it was at that third bar that we crammed ourselves into an old photo booth, and Gianna reluctantly offered $5 to the slot, and we laughed red-faced into a tiny camera. After the photos spit out into the compartment, the others slid through the red curtains, but before I could follow, May grabbed my wrist. She held me back, sliding her long baby blue nails up my wrist. I shivered. "You never gave me a birthday present," she whispered, and I could feel her breath on my face. If I was wearing my glasses, they would been fogging up. "Yeah, well, I didn't get to finish my quip before she kissed me. It was nice, and then it wasn't." "Hey," Will called out to me, squeezing through a crowd of men wearing tattered leather jackets to get to me. "Arden, where's everybody else?" I blinked, looking around. I could have sworn they had been right there a second ago, but now none of them were anywhere to be found. I shrugged. "Dunno why. What's up?" He finally broke free from the swaying mass, and I got a better look at him. He looked worried. His face was flushed, and I could see a few drops of sweat creeping out from his hairline. He took his phone out of his pocket and held it out to me. First I saw his home screen. It was him next to a girl with strawberry blonde hair, both clutching beer bottles and grinning widely at the camera. Then I looked where he actually wanted me, to the time, 1:47 a.m. "It's getting late," he narrated. "Can we find the others and get going?" I understood then. He was worried. It was past 1 a.m. and no alarm yet. It was later than usual. The bars would start closing soon. He wanted to get back before it happened. Will and I weaved through the crowd. I was pretty buzzed, and I realized I was having a hard time moving my feet right, which made me feel embarrassed. I hadn't even had that much to drink. Was I that much of a lightweight? "We found them outside, chain smoking," Will explained the situation, while I swayed. The drive back was strangely tense. Mateo's music was turned down, and there wasn't any joking or boisterous gossiping like there had been on the way out. We all felt it. It didn't need to be said. Something was off. Will drove fast, almost reckless in the dark. May took my hand just as he was careening around the last corner, and we could almost make out the shape of our apartment building down the street. It happened. All of our phones went off at once. Gianna let out a small shriek from the other side of the back seat. "Do not interfere." Mateo turned back towards us, pressing his finger to his lips. Had this ever happened before? By their reactions, I didn't think so. It was different when it came when I was in my bedroom, when I could just shut the curtains and put my headphones on. I felt so small and helpless then, like I was gazing into the maw of something incomprehensibly beyond my understanding. I felt like we were all flies, and this neighborhood right now was the spider's web. Will drove slowly now, maybe 5 miles an hour. We were all still. We were all silent. Not even a stray breath cut through the quiet. Underneath the glowing streetlights, I could make out the side of Will's face. He was pale, and if I had seen his knee shifting as he pressed down on the brakes, I could have mistaken him for a mannequin. The car came to a stop. I followed his gaze all the way down the street to the dark horizon, and I saw what he saw: a silhouette. It was far too distant to make out what shape it took, but it was evidently humanoid. It moved in a shaky stumble, limping down the middle of the road in our direction, and in the overwhelming silence I could hear it, far away but still deeply urgent: "Help me, Will." Gianna hissed. Turned the car around. Will didn't move. He just stared forward, as white as paper. It didn't make any logical sense, but I knew what he knew. It was too late now. There was no use. "Help me, please help." I could tell now that it was a girl from its voice and its figure as it got closer. It was wearing some sort of white nightgown, not unlike the old man's hospital attire from that first night, stained with dark red blood from here. I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dry. I didn't know why that mattered to me. "Maybe," May whispered. Her arm shook against mine. "Maybe if we're quiet and we ducked down, it won't see us." Deep down it felt as hopeless as turning around had felt, but it seemed reasonable. I nodded and did as she suggested, crouching behind the passenger seat, my knees throbbing from the strange angle I bent myself into. We all did it except for Will. He didn't move. He still just looked. When he finally spoke, I could barely hear him. It was so weak. "Shannon." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mateo was the one to break the silence. "What?" Shannon, he repeated, finally turning to look at his friend. That's Shannon. I peered over the seat. In front of me, squinting my eyes, the human-like thing was getting closer, and now I could make out strawberry blonde hair, round face, short legs. The girl from Will's phone lock screen, the girl who had disappeared. Shannon May gasped. Next to me, dude, Mateo said slowly, his words crumbling as soon as they left his mouth. I know what you're thinking, dude. Do not get out of this car. Will didn't even seem like he was with us anymore. He was in shock. I think, looking back, I have to help her, he insisted, right as another sickening cry rang out. Help me. Help. Help me, please, someone. It hurts. It was getting far too close to us for comfort, but it still didn't seem to notice the car. Its cries became more and more desperate as they got louder. I have to help her, Will repeated, and a bit of life had returned to his face. Mateo shook his head and grabbed at his sleeve. Will, that is not Shannon. Will glared at him, his eyes shining with tears. I know Shannon. That's her. I know you do, dude, and I know you miss her. But please, please don't do this. Their voices were getting louder and more distraught, and I felt May press into my side, trembling like a leaf. Gianna was whimpering, but I couldn't see her from my position. The thing was almost to our car. When it stopped, she turned her head left and right, almost like she was sniffing the air. The boys stopped arguing. I felt like my heart would burst out of my chest. I could see Shannon's face now, and I realized why she had seen us. The girl's face was streaked with gore, and it looked like her eyes had been scooped out with a melon spoon. She cried, drool pouring from her slackened mouth, but no tears could come. It happened too quickly. None of us could stop him. Will violently ripped his arm away from Mateo, fumbling for the handle to the car door. Gianna screamed. Mateo tried to slam down on the lock, but he missed, and Will managed to get the door open before he could try again. He stumbled onto the asphalt and hit the ground with a soft crunch. The thing turned her head and began to scream. But instead of charging at Will, she backed away. She held her arms out in front of her, like something might attack her, whipping her head around wildly. An alarm went off like the one I had heard that one night, but far more unbearable now that I was in it. The streetlights lining either side of the street switched to a flashing red, and Mateo threw himself into the driver's seat, the tires screeching as he peeled away. Gianna was screaming at him, pleading with him to go back. May was weeping into her hands. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't understand. As we sped away, I looked back. I couldn't help it. I saw the flash of some sort of van in the blinding red light pulling around the corner. Then nothing. That was a week or two ago. I don't know. I've been having a hard time keeping track of time. None of us have spoken much since that night. We tried the police, of course, but as you could assume, nothing came of it. I think whatever this is far larger than we know. I don't know if it's some kind of experiment or just a sick game, but I'm going to move back into my parents' house next week despite all their berating, and then figure out what to do from there. I don't know if that was really Shannon that we saw that night or if it was something else, and I don't know which is worse. All I know is that last night I heard Will's voice outside my window, crying, pleading for help. I didn't interfere. Stories number 2. I took my family to a water park. It ruined our lives. Okay, buddy, we're right here. If you hurry, we can hit the wave pool before we go. I ruffled Will's hair, gave him a little push. He folded his arms, defiant. The racing slide, it's the funnest one, most fun, I corrected. And whatever you say, Willie, he nodded with a HMPH, satisfied, and scurried off. He weaved his way through the molasses of the crowd, splitting families and couples as he homed in on the dilapidated porta potty. This was one of the few recent attempts Will had dared to use the bathroom all by himself. He was capping a good run, but being out of the house, I kept an eye on the door for any signs of distress. Said it 100 times. I wouldn't noticed anyone coming or going. Maybe 5 seconds. I looked away. Was that enough time for him to jump out and run off in the opposite direction? About 5 minutes after he had gone, I got up. I leaned on a casual arm against the porta potty in a whisper, shout over the drone of the few hundred happy poolgoers behind me. Buddy, it's me. How's it going in there? There was movement inside. I swear it wasn't my imagination. I heard something. I turned and saw my wife. Dipped it in one hand and waving with the other. Can't call it a day at the water park without ice cream. I smiled and wrinkled my nose as a joke. All right, Will, I'm coming in. The door was unlocked. I made an effort to open it as little as possible and slip inside. I did a double take, turned a full 360, checked the neighboring port, a potty, and returned. No, he couldn't have. I peered down past the toilet seat. Log sized turds floated in the septic stew below Will. I stepped outside and circled the porta potty. Will. I called again. My wife appeared next to me, holding Leela's hand. What happened? Where's Will? She asked. I don't know, he was inside. Leela, did you see him leave at all? My daughter shook her head, thrusting a spoonful of dots into her mouth. You were supposed to be watching him, my wife said. I know. I grabbed the arm of a man nearby. Excuse me sir, did you see my son leave this porta potty here? I described Will in detail. He saw the desperation in my eyes but shook his head. Sorry. Try the lifeguard station. I'm sure this happens all the time. He wished us luck and I thanked him. My wife was beginning to cry. She was starting to scare Leela. I ran ahead, cutting through one of the splash pads and hopping the fence to the lifeguard station. Oh, excuse me sir. Some acne riddled teenager with a red and white uniform stood up from behind the desk. You, my son? I can't find my son. Is there some announcement you can make? Something? The teen closed his eyes. Yeah, give me 1 sec. I'm kind of new, so I think I don't have a second. If you can't help, then get me a goddamned manager. I snarled. A petite girl, also in high school by the looks of it, turned the corner, oblivious to the nature of the conversation. Hey, you can't talk to him like that. She pouted. There's no need to be rude. I stabbed my finger at her. My temper at the end of its wick will be as rude as I damn well like. Get me a fucking manager or I'll go back there and find one. The police were called primarily for me. I was screaming, knocking things over, foaming at the mouth. My wife said the cops said I would have to calm down or they'd handcuff me. They send out an announcement over the park's PA system. William, your parents are looking for you at the lifeguard station. If you can find a lifeguard, we can get you back together as soon as possible. Don't worry, the lifeguard manager said. We radiated all our employees. He'll be back in no time at all. As it turns out, lost and found children in places like these is fairly common. The problem was Will never turned up. How do you go home after that? We stayed as long as we could, but it's not like we could sleep on the slides, so the same day I left for the water park with my family. We returned one short. Leela didn't know what was happening. We told her Will had gotten lost and the police were looking for him. She asked why we weren't looking for him. She began to cry. The funny thing about humans is how simultaneously effective and ineffective we are at lying to ourselves, because a deep part of yourself, something in your core where you know you can trust it, smells the bullshit, and yet we'll take that lie and run far as we can until our legs give out or we crash face first into a wall. After the first day, that piece of me in my core knew I'd never see Will again, but I ran like hell. My lust for closure deflated my marriage like a water balloon with a leak. I was stupid to think I wouldn't get laughed out of the court during custody proceedings, but the one reprieve I had came yesterday. I couldn't have answers. If I couldn't have my family or my son back then, I'd have some sweet revenge. This last year I'd been leading media campaigns, doing interviews, degrading myself to what I used to frown on and call an activist, all to destroy the water park that took my son. The park was small, got a lot of bad press in the local outlets where most of their customers were. Apparently this wasn't the first incident in the park's history, far from it actually having a long list of lawsuits and scandals. But it was the last straw and eventually they were forced to close. Yesterday was the first day of the demolition. I watched it in person, won an audience, and it felt good. I was getting ready to leave around midday when a commotion in the site held me. Axe grabbed the axe. The crew was in mayhem, and advantageous to my curiosity, no one was around to stop me hopping the barrier to get a closer look. It's dead. Stop, it's dead. I was too far to see what the men were standing over and crept closer. Fucker, that's a world record. Call someone. Who? The police. Animal control. Call someone. Christ's sake, where did you find it? In here. Well, go check it. Be careful too. I felt my way along a bulldozer close enough now and stuck my head past the edge. The scene made my knees buckle. I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. Dead and covered in hacks and slash marks was a python. Never mind a snake, it was the largest animal I'd even seen up close, long as a school bus, longer, even stretched out despite its size. It looked thin, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Tell me what happened, one of the construction crew asked a younger member. We was using the machine and clearing the area like she said when and knocked over them porta potties and the dragon came rearing its head out one of them holes beneath. The crew began to bus taking pictures of the beast and kicking it. The construction man nodded and called for the worker who had gone to check the hole. Come on out, that's a shithole, nothing to find. B-boss. The site fell silent. What is it? There's bones down here. I woke up screaming the next morning, wandered around the house until I went for the newspaper. After all the pieces were collected, the bones they found belonged to 10 unique skeletons. It was a reticulated python. The invasive one, 26 feet long, found the humidity of the park nice and chose a place it wouldn't be found Headlined the local paper for a day before it was pulled. Previous owners of the park still had some influence in the air, and what did I get? Closure. I would have rather been buried with my unanswered questions. Stories number 3. I worked as a night guard at a grocery store. They left a strange set of rules. I saw the job listing 2 weeks ago. Wanted: night guard at West Market in redacted PA 1 to AM 6 AM shift, $21 are the whole thing. Struck me as odd right off the bat. What kind of grocery store needed a security guard while it was closed? Was the crime really that bad? But I needed the money badly, and 2 days later, after a phone interview with a man named Clive, I showed up for my first shift. As soon as I pulled up, I sort of understood why they needed a night guard. The grocery store sat at the edge of a run-down strip mall. Large signs reading space for rent hung in the store windows, but judging by the dusty glass and flickering street lamps, no one had taken them up on the offer in years. I parked near the front door, and as I approached the building, I saw a woman hurrying away from the store. "You must be Erin," she said breathlessly. "The night guard." "That's me. Clive left you some instructions." I put them on the conveyor belt at register 1. She gave me a polite nod and then stepped around me, heading for the only other car in the parking lot. "Oh, thanks. Be friendly," my inner voice scolded. "She's your new coworker." I turned around. "Hey, what's your name?" But she was already diving into the car. The door slammed, the car reeled out of the parking space, and then she was gone. So much for a new friend. I turned back towards the store. The parking lot was completely empty now, and the nearest streetlight was flickering with an odd erratic rhythm. A cold wind swept in, whipping a crumpled paper bag across the parking lot. "Well, here goes nothing." I stepped up to the store. The glass doors squeaked as they parted for me, and then I stepped inside. Despite its outward appearance, the store was actually pretty nice. Inside, bright fluorescent lights shone from overhead. Jazzy music played from hidden speakers. I headed over to register 1, where a folded piece of paper was waiting for me. I flipped it open and began to read. "Dear Erin, welcome to the West family. We sincerely hope you enjoy your first shift. To help you, we've compiled a list of rules that should make your shift as easy as our fresh-baked apple pie. 1. As night guard, you are expected to patrol the store every half hour, making sure nothing is amiss. You may spend the rest of your time in the break room at the back of the store monitoring the security camera feeds. 2. Do not go down aisle 7. Do not look down aisle 7. 3. If you hear a knocking sound coming from within the freezers in the frozen food aisle, ignore it. 4. If you see a shopping cart that hasn't been put away, please return it to the shopping carts at the front of the store immediately. 5. Do not be alarmed if you find a pool of blood in the meat aisle. Sometimes our meat packages leak. Simply head to the storage closet, get the mop and bucket, and clean it up. However, do not step in the puddle or touch it in any way. 6. If you see a woman in the store, immediately go to the break room and stay there until she leaves. Do not call the police or report a break-in. Do not make eye contact with her. 7. The music we play throughout the store is a pre-recorded disc of instrumental jazz. If the music ever stops, immediately go to the break room and stay there until it resumes. 8. Do not under any circumstances end your shift early. Thank you so much, and again, I hope you enjoy your shift. Clive. I stared at the rules, rereading them slowly. They were so weird. A woman in the store. Avoid aisle 7. I'd never been given instructions like this even when I worked as a bouncer at a nightclub in a bad part of town. Maybe it was a test. They wanted to see how well I could follow instructions, no matter how absurd they were. I looked up at the security camera staring down at me from the corner. "Okay, challenge accepted." I glanced at my phone. 12:06. Might as well get my first patrol out of the way now before getting settled in. It was odd walking through the store when it was so empty and quiet. All the breads and muffins had been stored away somewhere. White opaque plastic had been pulled down over the vegetable display to keep the cold in. When I got to the end, I made a right into the meat section. Sheets of plastic had been pulled over the meat coolers too. I saw flashes of red through the gaps of massive ribeye and sirloin steaks, big slabs of meat with the bones still intact. I averted my eyes. While I wasn't a vegetarian, I never really liked the sight of raw meat. I turned instead to the aisles. Aisle 3. Pasta and sauces all lined up on the shelves, glinting in the fluorescent light. Aisle 4. Cookies and snacks. Aisle 5. Aisle 6. Oh right, I wasn't supposed to look at aisle 7. I forced myself to look down at the floor. Yeah, it was stupid, but they told me not to look in the off chance they were going to check the CCTV footage later to grade my performance. I was going to follow every rule. I continued further into the store. A few minutes later, I found the break room. A nondescript brown door with a little square window cut into it. I took note of its location for Lattice Soon as I was done with this patrol, I was going to break out my laptop and finish watching Friday the 13th for. And then I was at the west end of the Storeth frozen section. I turned down the aisle. Heading back towards the front, that's when I saw it, a shopping cart parked askew in the middle of the aisle. I huffed. Of all the rules, this was the one that annoyed me the most. I was hired to be a security guard and a cleanup crew. Wasn't it the employee's job to put all the carts away at closing time? Sighing, I began pushing it towards the front of the store. The wheels rolled smoothly underneath me. The jazz music played softly in my ears. I turned the corner and walked past the cash registers, heading towards the front door. That's when I heard it, a soft sound barely audible over the jazz music. I stopped, straining my ears to listen. Several seconds of silence went by, and then I heard it again. It sounded like someone crying. The hairs on my neck stood on end. There's no one in here. The door's been locked the whole time, unless a customer had accidentally stayed past closing time. Maybe that employee, the woman I'd run into in the parking lot, didn't notice them and locked up before they could get out. "Who's there?" I called out, a wailing sob in response. My heart plummeted. It sounded like a woman, or possibly even a child. "I'm coming," I called, breaking into a run. "Where are you?" They didn't reply. They just kept sobbing. I frantically continued in the direction of the sound, calling out to them, telling them everything would be okay. But then I stopped dead. The sound, it was coming from aisle 7. "Do not go down aisle 7. Do not look down aisle 7. The rules had been very clear about that. I stopped just short of the aisle next to an end cap display of mayonnaise and carefully positioned myself so I was hidden. "I'm going to help you," I called out. "Can you tell me what happened?" They finally spoke, but they didn't answer my question. "Help me," the voice cried through more sobs. Please." I wanted to step into the aisle. My foot was already halfway off the floor, ready to run in there and comfort them, but something stopped me. A gut instinct, a little alarm bell going off in my head. Because out of all the aisles, what were the chances this person would be in aisle 7? And besides, they were safe. They were in an empty store with me. It's not like they were in a dark alleyway in the middle of the night. "Come out of the aisle," I called, my voice shaking a little. "Then he'll be able to help you." "Please," the voice replied. "Help me. This is stupid. Clearly some person got stuck in here after closing time and they scared. Just go into the aisle and help them get home." But there was another part of my brain, the instinctual lizard brain part, and it was screaming at me to not move a muscle. "You need me to call someone. I tried. Your parents or family?" "The police." "Help me," the voice pleaded again. The "help me," it sounded the same each time. They said it a little stutter at the beginning, an emphasis on me. It almost sounded like a recording or some AI-generated thing, looping over and over. It didn't sound natural. "Come out of the aisle," I shouted. "Come out and it'll help you." The sobs got louder, faster, hysterical. "Help me," the voice pleaded again in a desperate tone that made my stomach twist. I stood there, pressed against the mayonnaise display. Listening to them sob was making my stomach flip open. If it did sound slightly unnatural, I could call the police. I thought they'd know what to do, except I'd left my cell phone with my backpack, a cash register one, and getting it would mean crossing aisle 7. The rules didn't say anything about walking past aisle 7. They just said I shouldn't go down it or look down it, and I couldn't just stand here and do nothing. What if it really was someone who needed help? A child who'd sprained their ankle and couldn't get up? "Don't worry, I'm getting my phone and calling the police," I called out. Then I took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold of aisle 7 towards register 1. As soon as I took a step, the crying stopped, just like that, violent sobbing, and then an instant thing like a switch had flipped. Then the footsteps started. Loud slapping footsteps of someone running down the aisle, way too large to be a child, coming straight at me. My heart dropped. It's a trap. They're coming for me, and I'm probably going to die here. But as soon as I made it across the aisle, the sound stopped. All I heard were the soft jazz tunes playing through the speakers overhead. I hightailed it to the break room, completely forgetting about the cart I was supposed to return. The break room was small and cramped. The little square window in the door had been blacked out with construction paper from the inside. The only source of light came from the computer screen on the desk displaying the security camera feeds. I scrolled through the feeds. I quickly noticed that none of them offered coverage of aisle 7. It seemed like the cameras were intentionally placed to avoid that aisle. After searching the grainy black and white video for anything amiss, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. When I finally opened them again, it was almost 12:30, time for my next patrol. I didn't want to go. I felt safe here, locked up in this little room, but I also knew I wouldn't be safe if I didn't listen to the rules. I shuddered, imagining what would happen to me if I'd gone down aisle 7 if I hadn't listened. I pulled myself out of the seat and headed for the door. The store was completely silent, no hysterical sobbing or pounding footsteps. I started my patrol near the back. Walking up aisle 17, cans of food glinted on the shelves as I passed. But when I glanced at them, I didn't see any labels I recognized. No chef ravioli or giant green men, just generically labeled cans of meat stew. In fact, all the aisle had was meat stew, the same cans over and over and over. I reached the end and turned right towards the front of the store, and that's when I realized that I had already broken one of the rules. The cart I had returned it wasn't where I'd left it. Instead of haphazardly parked near aisle 7, it sat next to one of the cash registers like some ghost man was checking out his groceries. I paused for a second, hands hovering above the handle, then I grabbed it and headed towards the door. Outside, the parking lot was pitch black, not a single street lamp. The shopping carts are only a few feet from the door. I told myself, just go in and out, it'll take 2 seconds. I did it as quickly as possible. I ran into the darkness, slammed the shopping cart into the row, and dashed back inside. Then I shut the doors and clicked the lock. Okay, that wasn't too bad, I said to myself, letting out a sigh of relief. For a second I reveled in the peace of the store, the silence, the safety of being locked inside with no one else with me. But then I stopped. The silence. Oh no, the jazz music wasn't playing. How long had it been off? I'd been so preoccupied with returning the cart I wasn't even paying attention. I broke into a sprint towards the back of the store, cookies and snacks flashing by me. Then I swerved right and sprinted into the break room. I pulled out the list of rules and read them over again. Do not under any circumstances end your shift early. Why did he write that? Was it just because he didn't want anyone flaking out on him? Or if I left early, would some horrible fate befall me because I really wanted to leave? I opened my backpack, pulled out the soda I'd brought and popped it open, took a sip, scrolled through the security feed. 5 more hours, the next 4 patrols went fairly well. The rules didn't say how long they had to be, so every 30 minutes I sprinted a lap around the store as fast as I could. The whole thing only took about a minute. Then for the other 29 I locked myself in the break room. On the second patrol I heard knocking as I ran down the freezer aisle. It started as light tapping across the glass, then crescendoed into loud thumps like someone was slamming their palms against the glass doors. As per the rules, I ignored it. I just kept running until I made it back to the break room. On the last patrol the music had cut out again, so I quickly detoured and got to the break room as quickly as I could, the silence ringing in my ears. And now here I was in the break room with 3 hours left. I stared at my phone's clock, ticking slowly towards 3 a.m. I stood up, shaking out my nervous energy, preparing myself to sprint. I'd been a runner back in high school, but in the past 10 years I'd gotten way out of shape. The last patrol had left me panting and breathless, legs aching. My hand closed around the doorknob, my heart hammered in my chest. 3 to 1 go. I wrenched the door open and shot out into the store, but I didn't get very far because there was an enormous pool of blood on the floor. I froze, all the air sucked out of my lungs. I stared at the blood shining in the fluorescent lights. The rules said to clean it up, but that would take at least 10 minutes. I wasn't safe out here. I swallowed, then I hurried to the supply closet, got a mop and a bucket and started cleaning as fast as I could. The job was messy. I slid the mop through the blood, then dunked it in the bucket, rinsed and repeated the soapy water tinged red a few times. It splashed up and almost landed on me, but I did it. I cleaned it all up without touching a drop. Unfortunately, by the time I was finished, it was 3:27, time for my next patrol. I was too tired to run, so I settled for a brisk walk around the store. I headed up through the frozen food aisle. Noticed now there were handprints on the glass door, handprints of all sizes, tilted and smudged, except the proportions looked all wrong, with fingers that were too long to thin. I averted my eyes and kept going. 2.5 more hours. My footsteps clicked against the tile floor. The jazz was starting to grate on my nerves. He must have heard the same looping saxophone melody 20 times. Now it made me want to punch something. Sighing, I continued towards the produce section, briskly walking past the aisles. Then I stopped. Something caught my eye in one of the aisles. I backed up and took a better look. Someone was standing in aisle 9, a woman. She wore a blue linen dress and black high heels. Long black hair cascaded down her back almost to her waist. She faced away from me, standing still, her thin white arms hanging limply at her sides. In her hand was a basket filled with cuts of raw meat. The rule echoed in my head: if you see a woman in the store, immediately go to the break room. Do not make eye contact with her. I slowly backed up as quietly as I possibly could. Then I started down the next aisle towards the break room. Click, click, click. I heard her footsteps echo against the tile. I hurried my pace towards the break room, but then I stopped. Her footsteps weren't coming from behind me, they were coming from in front of me. I averted my eyes to the floor just as I saw two black high-heeled shoes step into the aisle. I stared at the floor. Do not make eye contact with her. Do not make eye contact with her. The words repeated over and over in my head, but I had to get to the break room and she was standing in my way. All I could see were her shiny high-heeled shoes and the little drops of blood that leaked out of the meat packages in her basket, staining the floor. I backed up. That was the only way I could go. I kept my eyes on the floor, careful not to look up, but she was following me. Click, click. For every step I took, I saw a shiny black heel come into view attached to a thin white calf extend. Keeping time with me, I quickened my pace. So did she. Click, click, click. I wheeled around and broke into a sprint. Click, click, click. I ran down an aisle at random and sprinted towards the break room, but then halfway down the aisle I stopped. A shopping cart was parked across the middle of the aisle, blocking my way. Not just one cart, several of them, stacked up in a teetering tower that was nearly as tall as the aisles themselves. I was trapped. I backed away, my heart pounding. Click, slow, methodical footsteps coming towards me slowly like a cat stalking its prey. I took my chances. I turned around, sprinted back out into the open, and stepped into the next aisle. Oh no, no, I knew it instantly. A tattered lump of gray clothing and sickly pale blue skin sat on the floor. The person's creaturette thing folded in on itself in a pose reminiscent of a crying child, but it obviously wasn't anything resembling a human with its strange lumps and appendages and complete lack of head. I'd stepped into aisle 7. I immediately reversed direction, but not before the thing unfolded itself and began to move towards me. I whipped around and, screaming, sprinted down the next aisle. Miraculously, I made it to the end in one piece. I veered sharply left towards the break room. Almost there, almost there. My hand hit the doorknob. I wrenched it open and dove inside. Then I collapsed in the chair, panting. I sucked in a breath, staring at the locked door. Am I really safe in here? Technically, the rules never said I would be safe. Maybe staying in here only decreased my chance of death. I turned my attention to the security camera feed on the monitor. It showed the middle of the store, and from what I could see, the aisles were empty, no trace of the woman. I switched to the next feed, the produce section empty. I switched to the next one. I jumped. She was standing right there in front of the break room door. She stood so still the image could have been a photograph, except for the blood slowly dripping from the meat in her basket. I swallowed and glanced away from the monitor. At the door, my heart slammed into my ribs when I saw her shadow under the door. Go away, please go away, I pleaded in my mind. The shadow of her head in the window tilted as if contemplating her next move. Now I knew why the window had been covered. I forced my eyes away and looked back at the screen. She was still standing there, except there was something different about the way she was standing. I squinted at the grainy black and white image, trying to figure out what was going on. When my eyes finally fell on her heels, I realized they were facing forward, but I was still looking at the back of her head, at the long black hair cascading to her waist. Either her hair was hanging over her face, or she'd turned her head all the way around. It must have been 20 minutes before she began to walk away from the door. I couldn't tell if it was just the low frame rate of these crummy cameras, but her movements looked jerky, her body lurching with each step. It made me sick to watch. When she disappeared from the screen, I let out a breath of relief. My hands and legs were shaking weak. Okay, think the rules said to wait until she left. All I had to do was watch the feed by the front door. As soon as I saw her leave the store, I'd be safe. After a few minutes of sitting there waiting for my heart rate to return to normal, I forced my fingers back to the keyboard. I pressed the arrow key to move to the next feed, then the next, and the next, looking for the camera at the front of the store. No, her face filled the entire screen. Her eyes filled me with horror. They were pure white, and no pupils, no irises, just pure white eyes threaded with spidery veins. I screamed and jumped back. Then I shut my eyes. The rules said don't make eye contact. Did that count? Through the screen, I let out a terrified, shuddering wail and covered my face with my hands, my entire body shaking. When I finally took a peek through my fingers, I saw her rapidly scaling down the wall away from the camera on the ceiling like some kind of spider. Then she pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the night shed. Left, I was safe, or as safe as I could be in this cursed grocery store. I glanced at the clock, 3:58 a.m. Time to patrol. I really didn't want to, but I forced myself to swing the door open and run as fast as I could through the store. I saw shopping carts stacked in teetering towers, heard hands pounding against the freezer doors, saw little spots of blood on the shiny tile from the woman as she'd stalked me. And then a minute later I was done. I locked myself in the break room, and for the first time in years Began to sob. The remaining patrols went by without incident, though I did hear more sobbing. From aisle 7 and more banging from the freezers, and then the hour had come. 6 a.m. My heart soared at the sight of the pink dawn sky through the glass doors. I was safe, I was free. When I glanced out into the parking lot, I saw a few cars pulling in, disgruntled, groggy employees clutching coffees heading towards me. As soon as the first one came in, I flew out of the store, ran to my car, and got out of there as fast as I could. I'd never felt such relief, such happiness. I felt like a new man. All of my problems, even my financial ones, seemed dwarfed by what I just endured. When I pulled onto the main road, I rolled down my windows and flicked on the radio. But it wasn't my usual classic rock station that blared through the speakers. Instead, I heard the upbeat tune of a saxophone, and as I listened to that horrible looping melody, I realized that my days as a night guard for West Market may not be over yet. Stories number 4. My father walked out on me 20 years ago tonight. I found out what hour I had seen my father. In years, it had been 2 decades since I had set eyes on the man. My last clear memory of him was the one of him walking out the door when I was 5 years old. I had been watching cartoons. I turned just in time to see my dad's back as he walked out the door, wearing his standard blue jean jacket with his head down. As the door slammed behind him, my mother was on the floor, sitting cross-legged and crying a few feet away from me. The sight shocked me. My mom never cried. She was my rock, and I had never seen even as much as a tear from her. I crawled over to her and sat in her lap while she sobbed, completely at a loss of what to do. I remember I stroked her hair to comfort her, something she had done countless times for me when I was sick or upset. "Where's Dad going?" I asked innocently. My mom looked at her eyes red and puffy from the crying. "Your daddy is gone, sweetie. Your daddy left us," she mumbled. The divorce had to be done in absentia. No one knew where he had gone. I remember walking around town with my grandmother, putting up missing posters of my father. She could never accept that he had simply walked away from all of us. The posters stayed up for a few months before they all got torn down. Years passed. Mom remarried a great guy. I got therapy to deal with my dad leaving and eventually went off to college. Life was normal, though I never stopped thinking about my dad. Not really. Even when I thought I came to terms with it, I'd get the urge to Google his name or search for him on social media, but nothing ever turned up. That's why when he finally did message me, it came as a complete surprise. I was at work, messing around on my phone while I had reports to write, when it popped up on my screen. "Is this David Lewis from Topeka? And your mom's name is Penelope? If so, then this is your father. I have been trying to get in contact with you." I sat and stared at the message in disbelief. I set the phone down, then picked it up again and read the message. While I was processing everything, more messages appeared. "David, I'm so sorry for everything. For these years I stayed away. I really need you to answer me. I need you to agree to come meet with me." My first instinct wasn't to reply. I was half convinced this was some kind of scam. Someone knew about my past and they were going to ask for a Venmo or money transfer. I finally replied, "How do I know this is really my father and not some kind of scam?" I waited for a reply. My heart was pounding and a rush of thoughts were going through my head. If this was really my dad, I had a lot of things to say to him. Most of them weren't good. "I promised you your dad when you were a kid you had a ginger cat named Polka that died when you were 3. You had a stuffed teddy bear you slept with every night whose name was Mr. Simon. Please, David, this is really me and I need you to agree to meet with me." I stared at my phone. I was racking my brain trying to think of what to say. Tell him off. Tell him I'd gladly meet him because I had missed him all these years. I did neither. "I need some time to process this. Let me write you back later this evening. I'm at work and I need to focus." Holding the phone, I waited for his reply. It came quickly. "I understand, but please, I need an answer by tonight." Going back to my desk to work on the reports was almost surreal. It was like I was a ghost in my own body. I did get everything done, though it gave me something to focus on. Once I was home, I went straight to the bedroom and flopped on the bed, phone in hand. My fiancée wasn't home yet. Today was her late day at work. Of all the people I wanted to talk to the most, it was her, but she wouldn't be able to answer even if I did call. I read over the messages again. Honestly, I didn't have to reply. All I could block him, let him sit around and wonder what he did wrong to make me abandon him. But I did finally message back. The curiosity was too much. "Why do you even want to meet with me? If there's anything you want to say to me, just type it out." His reply was almost immediate. "David the first, I'm so glad you wrote back. I was afraid I had lost you. Trust me, I need to see you in person. If you never want to see or speak to me after that, I promise I'll never reach out to you again." I laid the phone down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. This was just too surreal to me. The front door opened and Alicia walked in. "I'm home." She called out. She walked into the bedroom when she couldn't find me. And are you okay? Did something happen? She asked, concerned. I shook my head and held up my phone. My dad just messaged me. He wants to meet me tonight to talk in person. He living room. She looked down at me and furrowed her brow. I don't know if I should agree to go or not, I explained, holding out the phone to her so she could read what he wrote for herself. Her eyes went wide. Of all the things I could have told her, this didn't seem to be one that she expected. She took the phone and read over the messages. What do you want to do, babe? I know Hayes your dad, but Hayes essentially a stranger. You don't know him. Anything. You still don't have to meet with him, Alicia assured me, holding my hand. I think I want to meet him, even if it's just to find out why he left. I want to hear it from him, I said, squeezing her hand back. I turned back to the phone and typed out the message. Where do you want to meet? Send me the address. His response, thank you so much, David. This means everything to me. And sending the address now. I was only mildly surprised when the address he sent me was only 30 minutes from our apartment. I looked it up on Google Maps, and it showed a tiny cabin out in the woods. I felt a stab of anger from knowing he was this close to me and was only now reaching out to me. How long had he lived there? Years? Months? I would find out soon enough. Alicia insisted on coming with me, but I convinced her to stay at home. She had the address where I would be, and if she didn't hear from me in 2 hours, she would call me, and if she didn't hear from me, she'd call the cops. She wasn't convinced yet that this wasn't some elaborate scam. I had plenty of time to think. On the drive out to my dad's place, when I arrived, I felt a pang of anger at the house. It was a lovely little log cabin. I knew enough about the area to know it wasn't cheap, and I wondered what he had been doing all this time to afford such a nice place, not paying child support. That was for sure. The car had barely come to halt before the door opened and a man opened the door and awkwardly walked up to the driver window. David, the man said, breathless, a small smile on my face. It was my dad. Now that he was here in the flesh, it didn't feel real at all. He looked haggard and thinner than his photo had let on. I stepped out of the car and backed away to let me out, the small smile still on his face. Everything I had planned to say to him vanished from my head as he gestured towards the house. Come on, let's get you inside. I have a lot to explain before it's time. He started moving to the cabin, not looking back to see if I was following. I followed. I started at the back of his head, glaring. He hadn't tried to hug me or touch me in any way, for which I was glad. But I was also disappointed that he hadn't tried. The inside was nice, minimally but tastefully decorated. It had a woman's touch, as Alicia would like to say. Maybe he had a girlfriend or even a wife. Mom remarried. His name is Steve. He's a great guy, I blurted out. My dad turned and looked at me. The smile fell from his face and his eyes dropped. I know, I saw that on social media. She looks happy, he said softly. I shrugged. I had said that to hurt him, but now all it did was make me feel a little guilty. Why did you ask me to come here after all this time? I just want you to know, if you are going to ask about getting a kidney or money from me, you can forget it. I snapped, my voice sharper than I had intended. I wanted to play it cool, collected, but I was too frazzled. He stared at me. His eyes were watery as if he was fighting back tears. He seemed at a loss for words. I shifted awkwardly on the couch, averting my eyes. I just needed to see you. I wanted to explain why I left him, not going to ask for forgiveness, but I do want you to understand why I did what I did, he said in a rush. I looked up at him. The obvious answer was that there had been another woman, or maybe some kind of debt to the mafia, anything really. But now that I was about to learn the reason, all I felt was a slow simmering anger. No matter what excuse he gave me, it wouldn't be good enough. I'm a werewolf, he said simply, spreading his arms in a gesture of resignation. I had to admit that all the things I had thought he might say, this was not one of them. I see, I said slowly. He was mentally ill. Maybe he was schizophrenic or had some kind of mental break. Look, if you brought me all the way out here so you could spin some kind of fairy tale about why you left, save it. I can tell you're doing well for yourself. There's no need to lie to me. I gestured angrily around the cabin. His eyes followed my hands as I pointed to our surroundings, and a tiny smile formed on his lips. So this isn't my house, David. The people who live here are on vacation and I broke in, but we needed a quiet place to talk, he explained, stepping closer. I stood up and sidestepped away, moving closer to the door. Are you serious? Do you have any idea how much trouble you'd be in if you're caught? You go to jail for stuff like that. I stammered. This wasn't going how I thought it would at all. I was wishing it was a scammer. It would have been less heartbreaking. He moved towards me. He lifted his shirt, and that's when I saw he had a gun holster on his belt with a small pistol housed in it. In a smooth motion, he lifted out the gun and held it out to me. I need you to do one thing for me. In all these years I've been away, I've done nothing but Tried to find a cure for this to end it, to cure it, it doesn't matter. All I could find was this: the only thing that can truly stop me is silver. I have this thing loaded with silver bullets. It had to be done by someone who loves the afflicted, otherwise it won't work. Trust me, I've tried the alternatives. His eyes were dripping tears as he thrust the revolver into my hands. I stared at it dumbfounded. Dad, this is insane. You're insane. You need to go to a hospital. I stared in shock at the gun. I'd never held one before. It must be done by someone who loves me. My parents are dead. I know your mom doesn't love me. It must be you. You're all I have. He gulped as he spoke. I held out the gun to him, but he stepped away and walked towards the door, blocking the exit. Look, we don't have much time. Once night falls, this will happen quickly, and you should know I don't have control over myself. When the change comes, I've killed people without even remembering it. You won't be any different even if you are my son. He gulped again, the color draining from his face. I took a step back from him on reflex, clutching the gun to my chest protectively. I didn't want to give it up anymore. I didn't believe for a second that he was a werewolf, but giving him the gun seemed like a bad idea. It's time to go outside now. No reason to ruin this nice house. He huffed. His breath was coming faster, like he had just run a mile. His face, already pale, was taking on an alarmingly waxy texture that was making my stomach turn. I had no idea if he was having a stroke, but he suddenly did not look good. He stumbled outside and I followed him, not knowing what to do. I glanced at my car. I could just run to it and leave, take the gun with me, and call an ambulance for him. Don't even think of trying to make it to the car. You won't have time anyway. He looked up as the last rays of daylight vanished over the horizon. It's happening. Forgive me, David. Please know I always loved you. I hope you still love me, he rasped as he doubled over, seemingly in pain. Dad, I gasped, taking a few steps towards him. No. He screeched at me, holding his hands out and backing away before he fell to the ground and started convulsing. It happened instantaneously. In the movies I'd watched about werewolves, the transformation is always drawn out, painful and dramatic. But this wasn't it. His skin split open like it wasn't even skin anymore. It parted like his flesh was made of paper. My vision blurred as I took everything in. The beast rising from the sheds of skin and clothing and looking at me. Its eyes were a vicious amber, glowing and filled with pure malevolence. There was nothing human in them. We stared at each other for just a few seconds before it took a leap towards me, closing the distance between us. In a split second I shrieked and brought up my arm, the one with the gun. The creature was close enough for me to touch. I could smell the wet animal smell of its fur as it reached out towards me. I fired the gun on instinct. I fired twice, one bullet hitting the thing in its cheek and the second in the chest where the heart should be. The beast let out an almost dainty and human-sounding gasp as it collapsed sideways. It looked surprised as it hit the dirt. I dropped the gun, my fingers numb from shock, and I ran to my car. I started the car and peeled out of the driveway. The headlights briefly illuminated the thing's body. As I drove away, it had moved. The shock hit me as I was driving, and I struggled to keep myself on the road. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that thing chasing me down, but there was only darkness behind me. I didn't call the cops or an ambulance. I cried silently the whole way home. There was nothing I could tell anyone that would make any sense to anyone. Alicia had waited up for me, and when I burst in the front door, she gasped and asked me what had happened. I couldn't tell her the truth, made up a lie on the spot that I had met my dad and he was a drug addict, asking for money, that the cabin wasn't even his but a place he had broken into. I had to talk her out of calling the cops. There was no way I could ever explain why there was a dead lycanthrope in the driveway. She stayed up with me until exhaustion finally took her and she passed out on the couch. I stayed awake, though there was no way I could sleep. I sat in the dark, sipping coffee and shaking when the first rays of light peeked through the blinds. I let out a sigh of relief. The sunlight brought sanity with it, and I could start trying to convince myself that I had hallucinated this whole night. That's when my phone buzzed, and I reflexively looked at the message that popped up on my screen, and my heart dropped. It was just a single sentence. David, it didn't work.